Hey my love, my name is Rachel Abbey and welcome to my channel. So I do videos all about self-development, personal finance, looking after your mental health, spirituality and so much more. So if you are interested in any of those topics, definitely subscribe to the channel. Now I wanted to do a video to help my first time buyers out there. Like, I am on this journey with you. I'm in the process of buying my first home, so I know how it feels to be on this journey and you literally just have so many questions running through your mind right about now. So I wanted to answer or make a video to help you, especially if you are at the stage of going on various websites online and just looking to see what houses are available. So one of the questions that I had when I was starting to look for properties online was like, what type of house should I even buy? Because as you know, there are like semi-detached houses, there are detached houses, there are terraced houses, there are bungalows, and it's like, well, what are the pros and cons of each? When it comes to buying our homes, especially if we're first time buyers, it is really important to make informed decisions. And I feel like the more we know about property and the pros and cons of the various types of properties, the better decision we would make ultimately. So what I wanted to look at in today's video is buying a terraced house. And the reason why I wanted to touch upon it is because terraced houses tend to be more affordable than semi-detached houses or detached houses. I'm not going to go into why. I think, you know, sometimes it's quite obvious why they're cheaper, but I know for first time buyers, budget money usually is a massive consideration when it comes to where we're buying, what kind of property we're buying, etc. So if you feel, or if you've realized that when you're online and you put your maximum budget in, if you're finding that most of the properties that are appearing in the search results are terraced houses, then this video is for you, because now it's for you to really dive deep into, okay, what will it mean to buy a terraced house? Like, what are the pros, what are the cons, etc., just so that you feel like you're making a decision with, you know, the right amount of understanding and information possible about buying these types of houses. Very quickly, a terraced house is when you see a row of houses on a street, so they're all connected, they're all linked together. That is what a terraced house is. When it comes to a mid-terrace house, it literally means one of those houses where it has two neighbors, so a neighbor on the right and a neighbor on the left. So there is a common wall between your neighbors. That is the definition of a mid-terraced house. And then an end-of-terraced house is where the house in the link only has one neighbor, so it has only one common wall with the house next to it, and then your neighbor, if you live in an end of terraced house, has at least two other houses attached to it. So that's very quickly covering definitions as to what terraced houses, mid-terrace houses and end-terrace houses are. Generally speaking, people tend to find end of terrace houses more appealing than mid terrace houses, and that's generally speaking. Not everyone finds them more appealing, but because end terrace houses tend to give you the look and feel almost of buying a semi-detached house, that's why a lot of people feel like they've struck it lucky if they've been able to bag themselves an end of terrace house. But let's look at the pros and cons of, you know, each. So starting off with end terrace houses, one of the pros of buying an end of terrace house is the fact that it usually means that you're subject to less noise from your neighbours. And this is simply because you have only one neighbour, as opposed to if you're living in a mid-terrace house where you have two neighbours. It's almost like you have twice the chance of being unlucky and having two noisy neighbours living right next to you. And when it comes to terrace houses, the walls of terrace houses are notorious for being thin, so you most likely will be able to hear your neighbour's television through the walls. You'll be able to potentially hear your neighbour snoring if they snore quite loudly through the walls. You'll be able to hear like your neighbour's kids screaming in their house through the walls. So noise is a, you know, it's a very important thing. So if you know already from the get-go that you don't want to hear a lot of noise from your neighbours. You just want peace and quiet, or as much or as little noise as possible. And for whatever reason, you know, semi-detached houses are out of your price range, or you can't find a semi-detached house online that is like in the type of condition that you require from the property that you're buying, then I definitely suggest to look solely at end of terraced houses, because you know, you may be unlucky, yes, and end up moving into an end of terrace house and your one neighbour is the noisiest neighbour on earth. But you know, the fact that you don't have two neighbours, it reduces the chances of you having a noisy neighbour living next door. So that definitely is one of the pros of end of terrace houses, the mere fact that you usually have less noise to deal with. The second pro of end terrace houses is that they tend to be more expensive than mid terrace houses. Of course, this isn't, you know, true for every single terraced house on earth, but generally speaking, they do tend to cost a bit more money. Again, you may be wondering, like, well, how is this a pro, Rachel, if it costs more money? But think about long term. If you happen to end up selling that property later on down the line, most likely you'll be able to put it on the market for a higher amount than the mid-terraced houses on your row may be able to sell. So you potentially may be able to get more money from your house sale than if you had chosen to buy a mid-terraced house. So research shows that end terraced houses, they may be up to 18% more than mid-terraced houses. So that is really good for you if you're thinking about maybe buying a second home, or you know, investing, you know, making money from your first home. That may be a pro to you. And then a third benefit of end terrace houses is that they may actually be brighter than mid-terrace houses, and your end of terrace house may be brighter if, for example, on the wall that is exposed to like the street, if it has windows, you know, it may have extra windows that the mid-terrace houses don't have. So if light and brightness is really important for you, that may be a benefit to look out for when you're looking at end of terraced houses. And then when you live in an end of terraced house, you tend to feel less overlooked than if you were in the middle of the link, and that's because you don't have neighbours on either side of you. So perhaps when you're in your garden and you're facing the house, it may feel a bit like you don't have a lot of privacy if you can see like the windows of both neighbours' houses, or even like the windows of, you know, the houses further down in the chain. So when it comes to end of terrace houses, you do feel less overlooked because you're not surrounded by like houses on either side of your house. And if privacy is a really important thing to you, that may be a really huge plus. And then sometimes end of terrace houses actually have a slightly bigger plot of land compared to the houses in the middle. So sometimes you may find that your garden is bigger than the garden of the houses in the middle, or simply just your plot may be slightly bigger, or sometimes even the house itself is slightly wider than the houses nearer the middle. So again, if space is really important to you, then this can be a huge plus. This isn't a complete blanket rule though. There are end terrace houses where perhaps the garden is smaller than the houses in the middle. Sometimes the developer has wanted to create like parking spaces for other houses and they've shortened your garden, or sometimes, you know, your plot is slightly smaller depending on the street. So it's not always the case that your plot of land may be bigger than mid-terraced houses. So let's move on to the cons of end terraced houses. So we did talk about this before, the cost of them. So generally speaking, they do tend to cost a bit more than the houses in the middle of the link. So as first time buyers, usually we're not really trying to spend a lot of money on our first home, so it may not be a benefit, the fact that it costs more than like an identical house a couple doors down. So it's not an immediate pro, it is a con for first time buyers, the fact that they probably will be slightly more expensive than mid-terraced houses. But again, try and think long term. The fact that if this isn't your forever home, if you may be planning to sell it off or sell it on in a few years, or you may want to invest it, you may be able to rent it out for slightly more than one of the houses in the middle, or you may be able to sell it on to someone else for slightly more than the middle terraced houses are going for. So, but yeah, I guess if you're thinking about right now, then the fact that they tend to cost about 18% more than mid-terrace houses is a con, yes. A second con of end-terraced houses is they say that they're more prone to damp and moisture, and this is because of the exposed wall. So the wall that is exposed to the street, the nature, the elements, rain, cold, etc. So people tend to say that damp tends to collect on that exposed wall, and obviously no one wants to be experiencing or having to deal with damp. So that definitely is a con of end of terraced houses. And I guess this isn't this doesn't apply to every single end terraced house. I think this is probably more common in the older properties, so perhaps the Victorian end terraced houses. So if you're looking online at the moment, have a look at how old the actual building is, because I guess the older the building, the more likely you may be when it comes to experiencing issues with damp and mold. Another con is people tend to say that end of terrace houses tend to be colder than mid-terraced houses, and this is down to the fact that when you're living in a mid-terrace house, you have a neighbor on either side, so your house is kept warm. As they heat their house, the heat kind of like seeps into your house, and you don't have a wall that is exposed to the freezing outside cold air. Whereas when you're living in an end of terrace house, you do have that wall that is exposed to the cold, to the rain, etc. So it's easier for heat to for your house to lose heat if you have an end of terraced house. And this of course will rise your heating bills, so it will make your bills more expensive too. Again, this tends to apply more to older properties, so the older your property, the more likely it is that your house will lose heat, or it'll feel colder compared to mid-terrace houses. I don't think this is quite as common in the newer terraced houses. So if you're buying a Victorian property, for example, definitely have a think about this, because you may have to spend more money on your heating bills, or potentially fork out money on getting your house properly insulated to reduce some of that heat loss. And also something to think about when it comes to mid-terrace houses as well is access. This probably is something that is more applicable to the older type of terraced houses, but you may find if you're looking at Victorian houses that mid-terrace houses do not have direct access to a road behind it, or like an open field. This is called a right of way, or having an easement. So most likely if you live in one of these terrace houses where your only access to the road behind your house is going through your garden and then through your neighbour's garden, it means that you have a right of way through your neighbour's garden. So this is a con for living in an end-terraced house. It probably is extremely annoying having to see your neighbours walk through your own garden to empty their bins, or like if they just want to exit their house via the back garden, and it can cause a lot of disputes. It's actually known to cause a lot of disputes between neighbours, so I won't go into a lot of detail, because I think if you're interested in easements, rights of ways, etc., Google it, read up about it. But essentially, right of ways, or having a right of way, it can cause a lot of tension and arguments between neighbours. So what I would say is, if you're viewing a terraced house, again, this is one of the things that you need to ask the estate agent about. Ask the estate agent, is there right of way between my property and the adjoining property, and just consider if you're willing to experience that. Some people have right of ways in their gardens and they literally have no concerns with their neighbours, it causes no issues, but for other people it causes boundary issues, and it just can create a lot of tension. So consider that, especially if you're buying an older house, because I think right of ways are more common with older properties. And then the last con I have for you is called the bookend effect. So think of a row of books, they're all lined up in the row, and then the end book, or like the first book, are the end terraced houses that we're talking about. So when it comes to terraced houses and end terraced houses, the houses on the end, they are actually subject to movement due to like the heat from the sun, but also because of the elements and just natural kind of like shifting in the land. So the houses at the end of the terrace are more prone to shifting than the houses in the middle, and they actually say that the houses at the end of the terrace, they kind of like they absorb a lot of the movement of the terrace of houses on behalf of the houses in the middle. So it's almost like they take the burden of the other houses by being on the end. So again, this may be applicable more to older houses, but it is something to be aware of because it isn't uncommon for you to see end terrace houses that have cracks in their exposed wall, or sometimes the windows or the doors may become dislodged, slightly out of position, due to the house shifting over the course of time. And I'm not talking about like great visible shifts, but you know, a shift that is as small as an inch, like the size of a 50p coin. It isn't grand when you think about visually, but when it comes to houses and like structurally the way they're built, even a shift of just an inch can do quite a bit of damage to the house itself. And then a con also of end terrace houses that we often don't think about is that they tend to be more likely to be subject to things like vandalism compared to mid-terraced houses. So you may be, you know, if you're living in a city area, you may see a lot of end terrace houses that actually have graffiti on their exposed wall, especially if their wall backs onto a street. So that's really annoying to deal with if you're a homeowner. So think about potential graffiti. So yeah, look at the plot of land, and if your end of terrace house doesn't have like an outer garden or walking space, if it just backs immediately onto the street, this may be something that you want to be mindful of, especially if the house is in like an inner city area, or like there are quite a few like council flats around it. Just be mindful of it. And similarly, people who live in end terrace houses, they tend to moan a lot about kids sitting on their walls. So it depends on your plot of land and if you actually have like a low wall that surrounds your house. But if you're living in an inner city area, you may find that there may be like a group of boys or young kids who just tend to like hang around your wall or like even sit on it as well. That could be pretty annoying, and also it will devalue the your house as well when it comes to selling, if potential buyers happen to come and view your house at times where there's just like a group of teenagers sitting on the wall outside your house or like hanging around it. So think about that. And also homeowners, people who own end of terrace houses, also complain about kids constantly kicking footballs against their exposed wall. So yeah, a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to consider. I think it probably just comes down to the type of area the house is in. So make sure you observe the neighborhood properly when you're viewing this house. And if you're seeing lots of, you know, groups of young kids hanging around in huddles, or like kids just kicking footballs in the street, in the road, these may be signs to be mindful of if you're viewing an end of terrace house, because you don't really want to be having to go through or like experience or put up with these type of things. This con is a bit of a weird one because I wasn't even aware that houses like this existed until I was doing some research online. So if you are buying a slightly older terraced house, so perhaps a Victorian house that is, let's say, 130 years old, did you know that when they were built so that all the attics in your row of houses were not divided? So you basically share your attic with all the other houses on your terrace. Really weird. Imagine like going up to your attic and being able just to see all the way down through everyone else's attic until you get to the end of the terrace. For me, I feel like it's probably going to be a bit scary and dark, but that definitely is a con. It's also dangerous as well because it's a real fire hazard if you don't have those dividing walls between each house. And this is something that is, you know, applicable to older properties, because newer properties, they have to, you know, adhere to building regulations, and everyone knows it's a fire hazard if you don't have those dividing walls to actually stop fire and smoke from spreading. So this con, it only applies to older properties, but when if you're going to view a terraced house, you know, you've got to make sure that you have a look at the loft and also get a home survey done, so that they can actually check if, you know, there are proper walls in the loft that are like safety approved walls that will stop fires from spreading. And to be honest, this is not only applicable to end terrace houses, this is applicable to any house in the terrace. You want to make sure that your house is protected from fire, so you know these walls actually help stop fires from spreading from house to house and stop smoke from getting in the next house. And also from a kind of like physical safety point of view as well, you don't want a house on, you know, somewhere along in the terrace being burgled and then the burglar being able to go up into their attic through the common attic space and then down into your house through your hatch and then, you know, take stuff from your house. So having a shared loft or shared attic space creates not only a huge fire risk but also a physical safety risk as well. So this is definitely a con that is probably more applicable only to the older terraced houses. But again, make sure that you get your house checked. But you know, if you find that the house that you're interested in doesn't actually meet the modern day building regulations and doesn't have those partitioning walls, you're going to have to pay to get that installed. Potentially you may be able to split the cost with your neighbour, but it depends on what agreement you reach. Okay, so that is end-terraced houses. Let's quickly look at mid-terraced houses. And to be honest, we don't even need to spend much time on mid-terraced houses because naturally the cons of end-of-terraced houses, they will be the pros of mid-terrace houses because they won't have to experience a lot of the things we spoke about. So when it comes to mid-terrace houses, they tend to be cheaper, as we said before. They do tend to be warmer than end-terrace houses. You also won't have to deal with the vandalism that you may potentially experience when living in an end-of-terrace house. The security thing may be a benefit of living in a mid-terrace house. Of course, you do have the cons. So like we said before, mid-terrace houses, because they are in the middle, you are 2 times more likely to be living next to a really noisy, annoying neighbour. This isn't an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. There probably are many more pros and cons to each type of property that I haven't even covered here. So if you are seriously thinking about buying a terrace property, I would say go on Google and do even more research about these types of properties. In the next video, we're going to be comparing end-of-terrace houses and semi-detached houses and looking at the pros and cons of each. So definitely subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss that important video. Check out my first time buyers playlist. So I've created a playlist of all my property related videos that I've done so far, so that if you are thinking about buying your first home or you're looking at homes, you're going to view them, hopefully you'll find a lot of the information that I've shared so far helpful for you. Follow me on Instagram as well, because I post more content about personal finance, saving up for your first home, etc. on the Instagram account. So I will leave the link below and on the screen. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I truly hope you found the information helpful, and I will see you in my next video. Take care.